Good afternoon. It's so nice to see all of you again. I am so excited to have the entire first year class of the MBA class of 2021 in Anderson Auditorium today. Yay. Woo! For those of you who are watching live stream, I'm Ann Harrison. I'm the Dean of the Haas School of Business. Welcome to the first Dean Speaker Series of the academic year. Woo! So we're really excited to be holding this Dean Speaker Series, or DSS for short, during week 0. And this is the first event of a series that we typically have about once a month. We have a DSS. And these DSSs bring leaders from the business community to Haas so that you can get their viewpoint, have a sense of their insights. And it's really just one of many opportunities that you will have to interact with the broader community, and we really want you to take advantage of that. I did tell you yesterday that studying should be your first priority. I hope you all remember that. But we also want you to take advantage of these, and you'll be getting emails and announcements about them. So today, I am so thrilled to welcome Dr. Weijian Shan back to campus. He's actually a Cal alum. In fact, he got both his master's and his PhD, not just from Berkeley, but from Berkeley Haas. And in fact, one of my favorite chapters in this book, which I've been having so much fun reading, it's a chapter called The People's Republic of Berkeley. And he talks about meeting his advisors for the first time. He said, he went and he met these two lovely people. They were very approachable. They were very relaxed. One of them was called Janet Yellen. Okay. And the other one was called George Akerlof. So one of them became the chair of the Fed years later. The other one got a Nobel Prize in economics. Pretty amazing set of advisors. Let's go forward, fast forward. Okay, Shan is the chairman and CEO of PAG. It's one of Asia's leading, if not the leading, private equity investment firms. He oversees $30 billion in capital. Before PAG, he was a partner of TPG. He was a co-managing partner of TPG Asia. He's led in the past a number of landmark transactions, including the acquisitions of Korea First Bank and China's Shenzhen Development Bank, both of which made his investors billions of dollars. They were also so famous that they actually became famous HBS cases, which you can read about on HBS. He's also been a managing director of JP Morgan. He's a former World Banker. He entered in the Young Professional Program where he lasted 8 months, which is a little bit shorter than my tenure in the YP program. And he was also a professor at the Wharton School. But what we're going to focus on today is more of the beginning of his life. His book that just came out of the Gobi, My Story of China and America, is going to be the subject of his talk. And we're so lucky that we get to hear about this in his own words. So without further ado, please join me in a warm welcome for Shan.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so very much. It's a great pleasure, great honor to be here. I don't know how many of you are required to be here, how many of you are here voluntarily. When I was at Berkeley, if there's any lecture for which I cannot take credit, I will not come. Regardless, I'm here to talk about my book, Out of the Gobi. It is an account of a special part of Chinese history, which I and many of my peers, my generation, lived through. I think it's a very important part of the Chinese history. It is also, in my view, the most horrific part of the Chinese history. And my view is that you cannot understand the country unless you understand its history. And that's why I think it's worth to record what we had experienced as we were growing up in China about 40, 50 years ago. So let me bring you back to the 1960s in China. I graduated from elementary school. Sorry, I was about to graduate from elementary school when a big political movement broke out in China called the Cultural Revolution. But before that, there were some signs that there was political turbulence on the horizon. And if you look at this photograph, on the right-hand side, you see this gentleman standing next to Chairman Mao. And his name was Liu Shaoqi. He was actually the head of the state. He was the president of the country, and Mao was chairman of the party. And on the left-hand side, you see the front page of the People's Daily, the official mouthpiece of the Communist Party. On October 1st, 1959, that is 10th anniversary of the founding of the People's Republic of China. As you can see here, Liu Shaoqi was portrayed side by side with Mao as the leader of the country, as the head of the state. Only 7 years later, this is what happened to him when the Cultural Revolution started. This was in 1966. I was about to graduate from elementary school. I was 12 years old, and all of a sudden, all the schools were shut, and the country was thrown into chaos, and Mao called upon the Red Guards and the rebels to rise up against all the authorities in the establishment, whether in the government, in academia, or in schools, and people were hauled out to be brutalized, to be abused, and the head of the state, president of the country, Liu Shaoqi, was dragged out of his residence in Beijing, and he was subject to harassment, verbal abuse, brutality, and eventually he was put into prison without any public knowledge, without any process at all. And 3 years later, he died in prison, nameless, naked, nobody knew. And his ashes disappeared, and people didn't find his ashes until about 10 years later. And that gives you some idea of how brutal that political movement was at that time. His wife, the first lady, was 47 years old at the time. She was dragged out by a group of college students. Tsinghua University is known as the best university in China. And 300,000 of them held a rally to struggle against her. They ambushed her, they tricked her, they somehow captured her and took her to campus. And she was put in front of 300,000 students to be humiliated. They forced her to wear a necklace made of ping pong balls. And supposedly because she had a preference for Catholicistic lifestyle, and that's what they did to her. They put this necklace of ping pong balls on her, and they subjected her to these struggle sessions one after another. And eventually she was put into prison, into solitary confinement for 12 years. 12 years she stayed by herself in one cell, and she survived the Cultural Revolution, luckier than her husband. But just imagine, 47 years old, she went through that experience. This gentleman, standing next to Mao, was the first defense minister of China. He was one of the founding fathers of the People's Republic, and he was the commander-in-chief of the Chinese forces in the Korean War. as you know, China and the United States had a war in Korea in 1950, from 1950 to 1953. He led the Chinese forces to fight the American and UN forces to a standstill at 38th parallel, which stands even today. So he made a great contribution to this new China People's Republic. But in 1958, Mao launched a big industrialization policy called Great Leap Forward, which was supposed to accelerate industrial production in the country. And those policies eventually led to what I would call Great Famine between 1960 and 1962. I was very small, but I still vividly remember the starvation that we went through during that period of time. In 3 years between 1960 and 1962, 36 million people, according to the most reliable estimates that I have seen, 36 million people died of starvation. 36 million people represented about 5% of the entire Chinese population died during those 3 years of starvation because of the failure of industrial policies of Great Leap Forward. And Peng Dehuai, that's his name, was mildly critical of Mao's policies of Great Leap Forward. And for that offense, he was stripped of all his positions, he was purged, and he was exiled into the southwest part of China. And then during the Cultural Revolution, the Red Guards and rebels would not let him off the hook. They dragged him all the way to Beijing and subjected him to this type of sessions, day in and day out. And eventually, he was persecuted to death a few years later, also during the Cultural Revolution. This gentleman, for those of you who read Chinese, you can tell, was the father of Xi Jinping, the present president of China. Xi Zhongjun. Xi Zhongjun was vice premier of the country, like deputy secretary of the state of the country. And in 1963, he got into trouble for supporting the publication of a book which Mao considered to be a poisonous weed. And for that, he was purged of all his positions, and he was thrown into confinement. He was exiled sometimes for a period of 18 years. He didn't come out until 1978, when Deng Xiaoping came to power. For 18 years, he suffered a great deal, and he was paraded by Red Guards and rebels through the streets as a counter-revolutionary, as a reactionary, as a bad element. And he suffered a great deal during that period of time as well. So the country in 1966 and 67 was in total chaos. All the schools were closed. And I was going to go to middle school, but school was closed. Initially, I was very happy. I thought that we were going to have a long vacation. I didn't realize that this vacation lasted as long as 10 years. For 10 years, for a vast country of China, there was no schooling. All the schools were shut down. And Mao reviewed the Red Guards and called upon them to rise against all authorities and asked them to go out of Beijing to spread the fire of revolution to everywhere, to every corner of the country, in a movement called Great Connect or Great Network. So he called upon the Red Guards to go to every part of China to spread the Cultural Revolution. There he is, reviewing the Red Guards in Tiananmen Square between August the 18th, 1966, and November of that year. He did this 8 times, reviewed the millions of Red Guards, and unleashed all the Red Guards to the vast land of China. And Red Guards could travel to anywhere for free. All the lodging and food would be provided, all in the name of revolution. I was 12 years old, and there was a big boy in our neighborhood who was 17 years old. And one day he came to me, he said, "Oh, I think we should just travel around to see the country." joining this great networking movement. I said, that sounds like a good idea. So I called upon a few friends, and we joined him, and we traveled together with him to many different parts of the country. As 12 years old, my parents didn't try to stop me because nobody would dare to stop the revolution. And I have a photograph to prove that I was actually doing that. And this is a picture taken in Weijian Shan, which was the first Red Army base that Mao established in 1927. We were visiting all these historical sites that the Red Army either established the base or fought battles. And I'm the second one from left with a cane in my hand, with a silly smile on my face. And so all the young people were traveling all over the country and in the name of revolution. But very soon, the situation got very, very ugly. Well, it was very ugly from the very start. I saw with my own eyes teachers beaten to death. In 1 month, in August of 1966, in the city of Beijing, 1,700 teachers were beaten to death by their students, mostly high school teachers. And I saw some Red Guards beating up a teacher, a female teacher, and eventually she died that very evening. But by the end of the year, Red Guards started to turn on each other because they all wanted to show that they were more revolutionary than other factions. So the fighting became very ugly, and they started with sticks, spears, bricks, and then the fighting escalated into guns, cannons, and even tanks. And eventually, Mao described the conflicts in China as a full-scale civil war. I was able to find one picture on the right on the web to show one of the scenes of fighting between Red Guards. The left-hand side is the artist's rendition of what happened after one of the fightings. Of course, many people died. Hundreds of thousands of people died in this full-scale civil war in China. Almost nobody was safe, and the entire country was in chaos. So even Mao thought things were getting out of hand. Things were too out of control. Just to give you an example, in Beijing, the Red Guards all of a sudden proposed that the traffic light was not right. Why? Because you have to stop at the red light, but red is the color of revolution. Why should we stop at the color of the revolution? So we should change it. We should go when there's a red, and we should stop when there's a green. The prime minister at that time, Zhou Enlai, was the only sensible person still in power, and he put stop to it. He said, if China changes traffic light system, then it will be chaotic. And in the cities, there were so many young people, millions of young people, elementary school students, middle school students, high school students, university students. They didn't have anything to do. There were no schools to go to. There were no jobs. And they roam around the cities looking for trouble, getting into fights, and it was totally chaotic. So Mao thought this was out of control, and he came up with a quite brilliant idea. He decided to dispatch all these young people to the countryside, to the most remote, most barren, the poorest parts of China, to reform our world outlook, to learn from the peasants, to transform the backward countrysides into, I suppose, socialist paradise. So millions of young people were sent away from the city. And I, along with my peers, were sent to the Gobi Desert of China, in the Mongolia part of China. If you look at the map of China, it's in the shape of a rooster. Look closely, it's like a rooster. Beijing is at the throat of the rooster. And on the back, the yellow color part is the Gobi Desert. And the red dotted line below the Gobi Desert is the Great Wall. So the Great Wall was built in ancient times to keep out the barbarians. And the desert was regarded as inhabitable by the Han Chinese. So that's where Mao decided that we should be sent to, the Gobi Desert. And that's where I spent many, many years. So I was 15 at that time. And all of a sudden, we were called upon to go to the Gobi Desert. And all of us had to go. All of us were asked to volunteer to go, but there was no choice. And no credit either. So this is the terrain that we saw when we first got there. And that inlay picture was myself just before I left for the Gobi when I was 15. And on this land, we were supposed to turn this into fertile farmland. We were supposed to grow crops. We worked extremely hard, years and years on this piece of land, under the blazing sun, in summertime, in deep, freezing, cold winter, we worked on this land. We didn't have enough to eat. We didn't have enough to clothe ourselves. We didn't have good shelters to hide ourselves from the elements. And I was making $1 a month for about 6 years. And we worked extremely hard, 12 hours, 14 hours, sometimes 16 hours a day, and very often with an empty stomach, trying to turn this Gobi Desert into fertile farmland. You can imagine how successful we were. I can assure you that the terrain looks exactly the same today as it was about 30 years ago. There's no change. You can't change nature like this. Here's another photograph of myself chasing a bull in the Gobi. It gives you some idea of the terrain over there. I discovered when I was there that if you see a bull, if you charge the bull runs away. If you try to run away, he will charge you. He will come after you. Sometimes I watch this Spanish bullfighting. I think it's all pretense, right? All they had to do is turn around and charge the bull, but they let the bull chase them. Don't try it. I tried it once in Alaska when I was there. I saw some bears, and I said I would charge the bears. And my guide almost suffered a heart attack trying to pull me back. My publisher doctored this photograph and turned it into the cover of the book. They somehow took away this bull. I don't know why. And they changed the direction, so I was not running into the spine of the book. I was actually running out of the Gobi. When we first got there, there was no housing at all, and it was already very cold. In the Gobi, in the desert, in wintertime, it is extremely cold. The temperature could drop to -10 or -20 Fahrenheit. And if there's no shelter, you would have it, it's very difficult to survive the night. So we initially just dug holes in the ground to spend the night in. And I remember shivering throughout the night, hoping for the dawn to come. And eventually, we built some huts and shelters by ourselves. And here's a photograph of myself on the right with my friend, Yi Baoquan, in front of the huts that we built for ourselves. Much better than sleeping in a hole in the ground. But in deep winter, the temperature inside and out was exactly the same because there was no heating. There was no fuel. The only source of fuel that we had was cow dung, cow manure. I showed you the bull. There's some cattle in the Gobi Desert. We would spend hours and hours scavenging the desert, looking for and collecting cow dung. When dried, they can be burned for a few minutes. So every night before bedtime, we would build a little bonfire And that would give us some warmth to enable us to remove our clothes. In that kind of a temperature, without any source of heating at all, it was exceedingly difficult to remove even one piece of clothes. To remove our clothes before we could get under the cover. And to this day, I'm very fond of sitting by a fireplace because it gives me this memory of the warmth from the little bonfire built with cow dung. If you don't agree with me, if you say bullshit, I don't take offense. That thing used to be very dear to me. In wintertime, typically in northern part of China, peasants don't work because the land is frozen, crops are in, the field is empty. So for 2 to 3 months, peasants spend time indoors in the warmth of their home. But we were not so lucky. We were organized like a military, and there were military officers on top of us, and we had to work to orders. So they order us to march miles and miles to a lake, which is frozen solid in wintertime, to cut reeds. Reeds grow on lakes, and in wintertime, you could go onto the lake to cut reeds. And that was one of the hardest jobs I ever did. So every winter I did this. That's a photograph of myself cutting reeds on a solidly frozen lake using this crude instrument with an iron blade in front of it. You will have to use all your bodily strength to push forward one step at a time to cut reeds. Our quota was half metric ton per person per day. That's slightly more than 1,000 pounds per person per day. And before we could finish, we were not allowed to take a break. We were not allowed to have a meal. And we typically work in a group of 3. So 1.5 metric tons of reeds we had to cut every day. We had 2 meals a day. The first was 8 o'clock in the morning. There was never enough to eat. And the next meal would be about 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Typically, by 2 o'clock, I would be so hungry because working so hard in such cold temperature on the lake, by that time, your stomach was empty and your energy all disappeared, and yet you still have to work extremely hard to meet with your quota. And not only cutting the reeds, we have to bundle them up, stack them up, put them on the ice sledge, and we have to pull the ice sledge with our body 15 miles away to a paper mill, one way, and then we walk back 50 miles before we could see our next meal. And we did this day in and day out, every winter for 6 years. Not only was there not much food to eat, there was not enough water to drink. Even though we were standing on millions of gallons of water on this lake, but the ice was so deep and so solid that we couldn't get down through the ice to find water. So what we did was to cut out some ice from the surface of the lake, and we would suck on the ice to quench our thirst. And I can tell you, in minus 10 temperature, trying to quench your thirst by sucking on ice is almost impossible. You know, your mouth, your face, your hands, every part of your body was frozen. What I did was to put 2 to 3 pieces of ice in my pocket. And from time to time, they don't melt because it was so cold. From time to time, I would take them out and suck on it to quench my thirst. And it was really a very, very hard time. Boys, it was still easier. For girls, it was even tougher. And when I was there, I also spent a number of years practicing medicine. I call myself a crack doctor because I didn't have much training, but I did practice medicine. And therefore, I was able to observe human conditions much more closely than many of my peers. When people climb mountains, when people suffer from frostbite, and you know typically the frostbites happen on the extremes of your limbs, your hands or your toes or your nose. In the Gobi, many girls have frostbites on their faces. And when you have a frostbite on your face, you're scarred for life. And I've seen so many of them with dark scars on their face because of the frostbite, because it was so severely cold at that time. We were deprived not only food, drinks, clothes, and shelter. The worst thing, in my view, is that we were deprived the opportunity for education. All the books, of course, schools were all closed. All the books were banned, and reading was frowned upon. I, in fact, kept up with my readings. I read whatever books I could lay my hands on, extremely randomly, whatever book I could find. The reason I became a doctor was because somebody spotted me reading a medical manual, and then the next thing I knew was I was appointed to be a doctor for our little camp. And but most people, of course, didn't read, and therefore they just wasted 10 years of no reading, no schooling, and no education at all. And I consider myself to be a survivor in the sense, when this ordeal was over, I at least had some knowledge to go into a new society where knowledge is important. But for most of my peers, they didn't survive because for 10 years, they didn't get any education at all. And many of my peers are so much more talented than I am, but because of the Cultural Revolution, they have never been able to make it in life. And many of my closest friends live at the bottom of the society and still live in poverty to this day because they never were able to get education. And let me show you a picture of a friend of mine. His name is Liu Xiaotong. I'm the one on the left, and he's the one holding a violin. This guy is so talented. He picks up a musical instrument, no matter what it is. If it's a violin he's holding, or accordion, or erhu, the Chinese musical instrument, anything he picks up, after a few weeks, without anybody teaching him, he'll be able to play the instrument beautifully. We compare his music with the music we hear from radio. He does extremely well, and he's that talented without anybody teaching him. And I still remember how he did all this trembling sound on his violin, and I don't understand where he got it, just by listening to radio. Nobody was teaching him. And he was an artist, he was painting, he was drawing. He had a little crude camera, which he took all these photographs, and he developed them and printed them with devices he built by himself. Very crude devices, developing and printing photographs with candlelight or kerosene oil light. And he's that talented. And he was also a great maker of seals and chops. He carves seals and chops. But after 10 years of no education, after the Cultural Revolution was over, he went back to Beijing, and there was no job for him. And to this day, he didn't have a decent job. And the way he got back to Beijing, as he told me, was he carved a seal, a chop, on the plastic sole of his shoe, which looks exactly the same as the official chop. And he created a certificate to certify that he was too sick to stay in the Gobi. And that's how they let him go and went back to Beijing. But after he got to Beijing, he couldn't find a job. And his life, in my view, was totally wasted by the Cultural Revolution. And he was not alone. Many of my peers didn't have the opportunity to study, and therefore they didn't survive the Cultural Revolution in the sense that they were able to make it in a more open society. Education, in my view, is a privilege deprived of us. And I see a lot of young people today, education opportunity is taken for granted. But for people of my time, to be able to go to school was impossible. I had that dream for years and years. What really was depressing at the time was the hopelessness, because we were told to take root in the Gobi, to spend the rest of our lives in the Gobi desert. And there was no hope of ever getting out. And I was able to keep reading because I didn't want to give up. And for most people, did give up. And therefore, there was never an opportunity to catch up when the Cultural Revolution was over. We were young, we were teenagers, but there were some older folks as well. This gentleman on the left, his name was Yi Kong. He was China's foremost civil aviation expert. He trained in the United States in 1940s in the Air Force, flying fighters and bombers. And then he served in the US Navy, as he told me, on battleships. Because at that time, China and the United States were allies with each other. So China sent some military personnel to the United States to be trained in the war effort against Japan. So he spent a number of years in the United States. And he, in 1949, right before the founding of the People's Republic of China, decided, together with a number of his comrades, to defect from the old regime to the communist regime in Beijing. They flew 12 aircraft from Hong Kong in January of 1949 all the way to Beijing to defect to the communist government, even before the communist government was established in October 1949. And those 12 aircraft formed the basis, the foundation for China's civil aviation industry that we see today, for Air China today. So he made great contribution to the new country, and yet during the Cultural Revolution, because of his experiences with the older regime in the United States, he was exiled to the Gobi to do hard labor together with us. And we felt very sorry for him. At his age, we were teenagers, and he was almost reaching his 60, and we gave him not very heavy job to do. So he was in charge of raising some pigs for us. And I have one chapter in the book called Pigs Don't Fly, because he was a pilot, and yet he was taking charge of pigs. And he was the one to open up the world to me initially, because he didn't have any books. And I had in my possession a few books which I secretly shared with him. For that, he was very grateful. So we built a very strong trust between the two of us. So he started to tell me about outside world. And I still remember how shocked I was when he told me that America in the 1940s was richer than China in the 1970s, because I grew up believing that China was one of the most prosperous socialist countries in the world. And I thought that the oppressed people in capitalist societies were suffering, and I had great sympathy for them. But he told me that that was not the case. And since then, I have lost the sympathy for the oppressed people. And he stayed with us until he reached about 60 years of age, and eventually he retired back to his hometown. This whole ordeal came to an end in 1976 when Mao died. And there was a change of government, and Deng Xiaoping came back to power, and Deng was a senior leader in the government. But during the Cultural Revolution, he was also exiled into a factory, a tractor factory in Jiangxi province, where he worked for a number of years. Now he came back to power. I think he and his comrades reflected upon the experiences of China under the communist rule for about 30 years and decided that the old system, the centrally planned system, had no hope of producing prosperity and richness for the country. In fact, it produced only poverty. We couldn't even produce enough to feed ourselves. And they decided to change policy completely, and they embarked upon the so-called economic reforms and open door. Economic reforms really means moving away from the centrally planned economy under which all economic activities were controlled by the government, but in the direction of the market, to embrace the market. Open door policy, of course, is obvious, and China started to open its door for foreign trade, foreign investment, and exchanges with foreign countries, student exchanges with foreign countries. In 1979, that is exactly 40 years ago, China established diplomatic relationship formally with the United States under Jimmy Carter. Richard Nixon paved the way in 1972 when he first visited China, but the formal relationship was not established until 1979, and this year is the 40th anniversary. So I was able to get a scholarship to come to the United States to study. So 5 years after I got out of the Gobi, with barely elementary education, I found myself in San Francisco. I don't know if anybody recognizes this young lady. That's Dianne Feinstein. She was the mayor of San Francisco at that time. And I was novelty as well, because I was from Red China, and very few people had met with anybody from China. So I went to many parties. I felt like a panda. People came to talk with me, and coming from a strange background. And that's how I started to study in this country. And at that time, America knew so little about China. Even though I didn't have any academic credentials, I came as a visiting scholar, and they assumed I must have had all the credentials, and therefore admitted me in all these degree programs. Altogether, I received 3 graduate degrees in the United States. I consider myself to have pulled my way through the educational system in the United States. And but it was wonderful as far as I was concerned, because for the first time in my life, I was able to receive a formal education. 2 years later, I got into the PhD program here at UC Berkeley, and I came, and as Dean Harrison described, my academic advisor was Jenny Yellen, and her husband was in the office when I first visited with them. I don't think many people actually know who George Akerlof is, her husband. He is Nobel laureate, a great economist who was teaching at Berkeley at that time. And I studied under Janet and some other professors, and eventually received my PhD. Professor Janet Yellen was kind enough to write a foreword for the book. So you should get a copy of the book. If you don't read the content of the book, at least you should read the foreword, which is rare. And among other things, this is what she said. She said that he had arrived at Berkeley to start his PhD program, and I was his academic advisor. I was stunned to discover that he had no formal math training. All the math he knew he had learned by himself, by candlelight. And by then it was too late. They didn't kick me out. I understand that my book is selling pretty well, and somebody told me that Amazon only put the best-selling books in their physical stores. So somebody just sent me a photograph to show my book in the Amazon store, and this is what I see. I'm not so sure about the company I keep. But I must say that somebody must have had a tougher life than I did. Thank you very much. Thank you.
All right, so we're going to open up to questions. This is going to be a little bit different than other speakers we've had throughout the week. We're actually going to have two mics that are standing here and here. If you can line up behind them, I'll get people in the front. And we're actually live casting this into Speaker Forum, and Lauren's getting questions from there as well, so I'll take some questions from outside of the room as well. But opening it up to whoever has a question.
Guess I'm up first. I wanted to say, first of all, thanks so much for being here. So I'm Chinese American, and growing up within the Chinese community, I think a lot of people found it very difficult to talk about the Cultural Revolution because of a lot of the trauma that they'd experienced that made it so difficult. And growing up as a kid, we never really learned about this history, so I really appreciate that you wrote this book, and definitely gonna pick it up next time I'm at the bookstore. My question has to do,
I understand books are available.
So I think as an American, a lot of us have kind of floated the idea of, or had the opportunity to go to China to work or study. But I think within recent years, and from personal experience, it seems like there's potentially been some reversion towards the bad old days. Like even when I was in China last month, I noticed some of the TV ads were referencing the Great Leap Forward with an air of nostalgia. I guess my question is, do you share concerns about a sort of reversion of the Chinese economy and politics towards some of the bad old days? And also, do you have any ideas or hope of how a conscientious person from outside China can engage with China, the economy, the people, business in a positive way in the future?
Thank you. Yes, I do have concerns. I think that if we don't remember this part of history we collectively lived through, then there's a danger of repeating the history. And that's one of the reasons why I wrote this book. I wanted to remind people what we went through and how dangerous it is to go back to the old days. But I think the process of marketization that is going in the direction of the market economy is unstoppable. Because if you think about the legitimacy of the ruling class or the rulers in China, the only source of legitimacy is economic performance, delivering better living standard. As I already explained, the old system didn't work. The centrally planned system was bankrupt. And what saved China is really the market economy. Nowadays, I hear so many people talk about China model responsible for China's rapid growth in the past 40 years. And I think that's total nonsense, because if you look at the facts, China developed not by the old model under which all economic activities were controlled by the state, but by moving in the direction of a liberal market. And that's what has delivered economic growth and a higher living standard for China. And in order to do that, you have to rely on the private sector. Today, the private sector is responsible for about 60% of China's GDP. So China has gone far along on the road of market, but still has a long way to go, 60% of GDP. China's private sector produces about 80% of tax revenue. And China private sector is responsible for 90% of urban employment. Such being the case, you cannot develop this economy, delivering economic performance without the private sector. So I think, like it or not, it is economic inevitability that China will continue to move in that direction. My firm is called PAG. As Dean Harrison mentioned, we manage about $30 billion. And we invest about $2 billion a year in China. And we invest mostly in businesses which cater to private consumption, to consumers. And our fund of 2012, $2.5 billion fund, buyout fund, produced an IRR of more than 30%. And our second fund, vintage of 2015, has produced an IRR of more than 33%. And our latest fund, which we closed in November of last year, is $6 billion because LPs, especially American pension funds, gave money to us. They like our performance. And that's why we're able to raise $6 billion. We're still investing that particular fund, but the early performance is very, very strong. So you look at the Chinese economy, there's a lot of potential, but the potential is largely confined in the private sector.
Thank you. Thanks, Ariana. My name's Diana. Thank you so much for sharing your story. I think all of us are kind of projecting forward. 2 years from now, where do you think that Haas students have a future in China? What industries are going to be exploding in the next couple of years? Where do you recommend we look? Should we invest in the Gobi Desert?
Maybe. The other day, I read an article that somebody built a space station in the Gobi Desert because you walk out of that little structure, it looks like the Mars. And so it became a tourist transaction. So people have become very creative. I think that in China, there are many good opportunities, but technology is where I have seen almost an explosion of investments activities in the past, especially 5 years. And some people tell me that it's easier to get venture capital funding to set up a business in Shenzhen, a city adjacent to Hong Kong, in China, than in Silicon Valley. And you've seen many businesses being built up very quickly. Let me give you a story. We invested in a company which today is called Tencent Music Entertainment. And 5 years ago, it was called China Music Corporation. It didn't have anything. It had a bunch of copyrights covering about 70% of all the digital markets in China. Copyrights in lyrics, in scores, in record labels. So the founder came to me and wanted to raise some capital. And we look at it, there was not a business as yet. So I said, Neil, how are you supposed to make a profit if you don't have a business as yet? He said that I have the market cornered with the copyrights. And I can enforce the copyrights. And there were 2 large platforms of music streaming businesses. And they would be forced to be acquired by me. And I will have a business overnight if I have this funding from you. I needed at least $30 million. We typically don't invest less than $100 million. So with some reluctance, I gave him $60 million to become the majority shareholder of this company 5 years ago. Today, the company has market cap of more than $20 billion. What happened? Exactly as he described. He had the copyrights, and the other 2 platforms saw the writing on the wall and decided to be acquired or merged by us. And overnight, we became the largest platform providing music, digital music in China. Today, we have monthly active users of 800 million. Only in China, you get that scale. And I often say to my LPs or investors that the business model has proven to be very valid. But if I take the same model to Singapore, I wouldn't get anywhere because the population is so small, and therefore you won't be able to build a scale business. Whereas in China, you can have 800 million customers. If you look around the world, you will find large tech firms are either in America or in China. Why? Because homogeneity of a large population. In the United States, more than 300 million people. That's why you have, Facebook, you have Amazon, and Google, and so forth. In China, it also has a very large population. And that population gives you the advantage. In EU, there are so many different countries and different cultures and different languages. It's hard to build a large-scale business. So that's where the potential is. I think technology is something I typically don't invest in because I couldn't figure it out. I think it's too risky. It's either unproven or once it's proven, it's too expensive. But for young people starting from the very beginning, I think technology holds a lot of potential. When I was studying for my PhD here at Berkeley, my PhD thesis was to look at the biotechnology, new pharmaceutical industry, which was burgeoning, which was just happening. And now just look at the pharmaceutical industry, biotechnology has become a mainstay of pharmaceutical industry. So technology is where I think the future is.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Murch, and I'd like to thank you for coming and speaking to us and sharing your story. My question, maybe not so much of a question as a prompt, but feel free to respond in whatever way you choose, is that we often hear that going through kind of hardships or some sort of situations like that, they may build character or resiliency or grit. And I was wondering if, given all the experiences that you've gone through, have you kind of reflected on it in a positive way and tried to put a spin on it to feel better? Clearly, it's you've had some success after it. And in light of that, how do you think about whether, like, what should I say? What level is appropriate of like a hardship for someone to go through to develop as a person and to become like a resilient individual, and in light of like the present suffering that they might go through in light of that?
I don't think there's a general rule. People go through the same experiences and come out of it taking different lessons. And in my particular case, when I was in the Gobi, it was a hopeless situation. But I reminded myself, I like history, I read history of every country to the extent I could find books. I reminded myself that there were so many talented, able people who never made it in life, in history, because there were no opportunities. Opportunities are critically important, and we see this all the time. And I thought that if my life was so unlucky that eventually I would not have any opportunities, I end up spending the rest of my life in the Gobi, taking root there, and perish in that place, I would have nobody to blame, because that was just fate. That was just life. But if someday the opportunity arises and I'm not ready, prepared to take the opportunity, I only have myself to blame. And therefore, I kept reading. I just read whatever I could find to read to prepare myself. I'm still doing it. So I think that if you think about it, it's impossible for us to plan our future. And you are very lucky. You can plan for your future. But to me, my philosophy in life is to be always prepared.
Thank you.
And very few people did that. And that's why most of my peers were wasted by the Cultural Revolution and by the hardship.
Dr. Shan, thank you for giving this speaker series. My father's a few years your junior, so he actually went through kind of the tail end of the Cultural Revolution a little bit in China. So I think next time I chat with him, I haven't really spoken to him about this in detail, so I'll have a nice conversation topic with him. But my question for you is, I think recently in the news, we hear a lot of what China is going through, both in things like persecution of religious minorities, to some of the protests going on in Hong Kong, to things like a social credit. And my question is, do you have any fear of how some of the political climate in China will affect business with China in the future, and how can we, as emerging business leaders in the future, help get a better understanding and be able to navigate that in the future?
If you look at the Chinese history, even in the past 40 years, it has never been a straight road. It has zigzagged over time. We know all the major political events that have taken place in the past 40 years. But I think the general direction is the consensus. Everybody knows that the market economy is where China needs to go. And as I said, it's still very far from getting to that goal. And there are a lot of forces pulling in the back. But if you look at the experiences of the Chinese economy in the past 40 years, whenever China steps up with economic reforms, then the economy steps up and grows faster. And whenever there's hesitation or setback in economic reforms, the economy suffers. So I'm a strong believer in economic fundamentals and economic imperatives. So I think economic imperative will be such that China will move in the right direction, and it may take a very long time. But you're young.
Thank you.
My name is Elanka. I wanted to say thank you very much for your presentation and sharing, I think, a remarkable story through the Cultural Revolution, to time in the Gobi Desert, and up till China's development up till now. So my question is, China has come a long way since that time up till now. Now, different contexts, there are African countries that are still very much emerging economies, and they face the challenge of how do you grow economically with limited democratic rights and also some relatively high levels of corruption. So what would you say was key or enabled China to grow despite maybe some of those similar contexts?
Would you repeat your last question?
So my question is, what allowed China to grow despite maybe a less democratic government, possibly, and also some levels of corruption?
Right. Well, China is certainly not democracy. But if you compare China today with the China when I was in the Gobi, there's already a lot of progress. When I was in the Gobi, there was no personal freedom to speak of. Of course, we couldn't leave the Gobi, and we couldn't find a different job, couldn't go to school. We couldn't go somewhere to find food, and we couldn't even have a girlfriend. That was not allowed. Everything was controlled by your immediate boss, and you couldn't offend him. And there was a lot of abuse as a result of that. And today, of course, at the personal level, there's a lot of freedom. You can work for the state-owned sector, and if you don't like it, you quit. You can work for a private company. If you still don't like it, you can set up your own business. If you still don't like it, you can leave the country and go elsewhere to make a living. So at the personal level, there's no comparison between today and 40 years ago when I was in the Gobi. Of course, when it comes to the political system, China has changed, but not so much. We still have one-party rule. I think that the reality of the politics in China is such that that situation probably will last a long time. I'm just hoping that there will be more democracy, at least within the party, as opposed to outside of the party, that maybe it may take a very long time for China to attain.
I think that's time, or do we have time for one more? One more? All right, last question.
Well, there are two people standing there, so maybe we give them a chance to.
You were there first.
Yeah, just quick. So my family's Cuban, my partner is Iranian, and we both talk a lot, pretty often about the sort of false promise of revolution. So we're super grateful for your speaking to that experience. You spent your formative years in immense scarcity and then went to private equity, which has a ton of abundance. Curious what that experience was like and how that impacted your career.
My wife always thinks I'm too frugal. I don't know how to spend money. And I come over here, people say you should order Uber Black. Oh, I said, no, that's too expensive. And in my investments, I'm extremely conservative. And my view is, it doesn't really matter if you make 3 times your money, 5 times your money. The most important thing is capital preservation. You don't want to lose money for your LPs, for your investors. And that has been our principle. And when I review an investment case, the first thing I look at is the downside. And when I'm assured that the downside is extremely limited, or there's practically no chance for downside, then we can look at the upside. And I think that has a lot to do with the starvation that I had. Just look at me. I'm risk averse. And it's very interesting. China in the past 40 years has developed largely because China has followed an investment-led growth model. China has invested 50% of GDP every year in the past 10 years. No other country at any time in history, at any stage in their industrialization process, has invested even close to 35% of GDP. And China, 50% of GDP. Where did China get the money to invest so much, so consistently? China happens to have the highest savings rate in the world at 50% of GDP. And how come that China uniquely has so much savings? It's because my generation, which doesn't know how to spend, we only know to prepare for a rainy day. I'll give you a story. The president of China Investment Corporation is a good friend of mine. He has retired, but before he retired, I went to visit with him. And their office is in this posh Italian-style modern building in Beijing, well air-conditioned. And the day I was visiting him, it was extremely hot. It was more than 100 degrees Fahrenheit in Beijing. But the building inside was very pleasant. So I walked into his office. It felt like an oven. It was so hot. So I said, Xi Jin, what are you doing? Why don't you turn on the aircon? Oh, he said, I can't allow myself to get used to it. What if the hard time comes back again? So I said, well, do you still eat? Starvation may come back again. You should stop eating. So that's the habit that we formed. And next generation spend beyond their means. We have a car leasing business, we know that. Young people buy cars on borrowed money, with borrowed money.
Hi. My name is Hiro, and I'm very impressed by your saying about the education. But the world has changed a lot, and recently we're inundated with the great educational material thanks to the internet. My question is, what kind of style of education is needed in this century? So
what kind of education?
Yeah, because we, thanks to the internet, we can access to a lot of educational material for free.
Yes.
So some people say that environment is important, and we can Google anything. So some people, the knowledge is not useful this century. So I would like to know your opinion for the education.
I think you have a problem of too many choices. When we didn't have the choice, I remember when I was in the Gobi, I swore to myself, I made a vow that I would read all the books in the world. And then I got to America, I went into a library, I said, oh no, this is not possible. When you have too many choices, it is hard to make a decision, but that's a good problem. So I think you raised a very good question. I don't have a good answer because everybody has a different preference. It's like trying to order food for somebody else. How do you know what he likes? Follow your instinct, follow your preference, and talk with your professor, and you will find your way. Thank you. Thank you so very much. Thank you.
So as Shan mentioned, you are all getting a free copy of his book. So Well, thank you so much for coming. On behalf of everybody that's involved with Week 0 and everybody that's involved with the Dean's Office, thank you so much for being here. How about one more round of applause? All right, so we just have a little bit more to get through, and then we're going to head out to our next event.